Hey, look, it's great to be along here. It's lovely to have such a huge audience. I'm sure that most of you are probably just avoiding something worse, aren't you? Yeah, I know that's right. But what I'm going to do is first want to talk about, before I read from Mirror of Love, I just want to tell you a little bit about the historic circumstances in which it came about. This was back in the last century. You probably don't remember it, and it's a bit of a blur to me, quite frankly. But around about 1988, we've got this woman, Mrs. Thatcher. Anybody? And she sort of decided to bring in this clause that was called Clause 28. And what that was designed to do was to not just oppress gay people. It was a real piece of Nazi legislation. It was designed to actually remove the concept of gay people from the dictionary. It was that schools could not teach anything that was pro-homosexual, which means that they couldn't mention it, because mentioning it would have been seen as being pro-homosexuality. This was unsupportable. And I know that me and my partners at the time, what we thought that we'd do is, because I'd got access to a lot of famous comic book people, I thought that I could probably, what's the word I'm looking for? Morally blackmail most of them to actually contribute something to this book. We even got Frank Miller, who in more recent years has turned out to be quite aggressively right-wing. But back then, yeah, we got him to contribute. And we put together this anthology magazine that was called ARG, which stood for Artists Against Rampant Government Homophobia. I didn't think of it, you know, but it was a good title. And we brought this out, we gave all of the money to the Organisation of Lesbian and Gay Action, Olga, as it was called. And frankly, they were real pains in the arse. When my wife and our girlfriend at the time went along to say, look, we're doing this project, we're going to give all the money to Olga. This was the 1980s, it was a different world, but a lot of the more radical feminist lesbians were kind of the opinion that, well, we don't want bisexual women in here. Next thing you know, they'll be inviting men in. They did, when we got them the 17,000 quid, it was a different story. They were suddenly a lot warmer to us. But anyway, good was done from it. I think we insisted that they put some of the money towards the police monitoring scheme, stuff like that. Anyway, when it came to my own contribution, I wasn't sure what to do. I thought what would be handy was if I put together a kind of an overview of gay culture, you know? And I thought this would be fairly easy. I thought I was just going to go down to some local bookshop. I was going to say, give me a history of gay culture, and then I'll swipe from that. You know, we're writers, we're lazy, essentially. You know, we don't like to do any really hard work. And I went down there, and much to my surprise, there wasn't any history of gay culture. There had never been a history of gay culture put together, which meant that since I'd already announced this, I was kind of going to have to do it myself. In about 4 weeks. So I did a lot of heavy research. And I put together this kind of prose poem that is a kind of history of gay culture as we understood it then. And bear in mind, this is back in 1989. We didn't know what was going to happen with Clause 28, which I think was taken off of the statute books 3 years ago. 3 years ago. That piece of legislation had been in place since 1989 up to 2010. You know, so obviously we did a massive amount to change the world with this, you know, sort of 20 years later, they finally took it off the statute books. So I guess this was a complete failure in many respects. But anyway, that's enough of the background. This is Mirror of Love. It gets, you might want to have some tissues handy. If only for me. It just gets a little bit emotional at some points, but I'll leave you to judge that for yourselves. Even preceding landfall, things loved freely once, ignoring gender. Blind desire made pond slime fish, turned fish to apes with sex, life's glorious engine churning in the mud. The animals remember. Dolphins still rotate their matings between their own sex and its reverse, their raptures echoing for miles. On land, the first societies, great herds of she-beasts raised their young together without males whose part in reproduction was unknown. The women licked and groomed each other with men watching, circling round. In the beginning, then, 3 million years of motherhood. The word came later, and the word was power, was patriarchy. Firstborn children squirmed on altars of a father god. The word was law. In Sumer, women scorning men had teeth crushed with burned bricks. Law, once conceived, applied to everything. Leviticus condemned most sexual practice as unclean, including that between two men. This was designed to snub the Canaanites, whose male priests practiced sodomy. Had they been cannibals instead, how different might things be? We gasped upon Devonian beaches, huddled under Neolithic stars, spat blood through powdered teeth, staining each other as we kissed. Always we loved. How could we otherwise, when you are so like me, my sweet, but in a different guise? We loved, while great Mediterranean cultures flourished, their homoerotic urges troubling them not at all. Regarding man-boy love as civilized, the Greeks and Romans made it thus a badge of class and rank within their careful edifice of power. The Spartan army ventured further. Male love was enforced, producing soldiers who'd defend their frontline lovers to the death. Demanding tougher breeds, they exposed infants to the elements, particularly girls. Perhaps because of this, by the time Rome invaded, there were only 16 Spartans left. Corinth's transvestite troops aside, this usage was unique. We were creators. Homer sought in verse to hug Achilles' shade, while on her isle exquisite Sappho reminisced of myrrh poured on her lover's head, of girls upon soft mats with all they most desired beside them. Yet this tolerance could not endure the rise of Christianity, which quite ignored Christ's love for outcasts and instead embraced moral severity. defining sex as base, an obstacle to faith, St. Paul named same-sex love for the first time as sin. Sin. Was that its name, which stole a kiss behind the interlocking shields of war? Sin that made Sappho weep and write, I have not had one word from her. With baby blood upon their hands, they saw our love and named it sin. Thomas Aquinas, by the 13th century, had systemised degrees of vice, including copulation with an undue sex. Since, in the high dark ages, such pronouncements were quite readily made law, burnings occurred, beheadings, bodies twisting slowly in the breeze. Although to hang for sodomy alone was rare, such charges loaned vendettas weight. Knights Templar, charged with sodomy, had instead pressed Philip of France for debts he couldn't pay. The Pope, owing Philip in turn, arranged the Templars' persecution. Then, as now, our love was used conveniently as a smear. As the Renaissance blossomed, cities gradually returned, and in their alleys our subculture thrived, a pale, night-blooming flower. Despite church savagery, an improved social climate once more brought forth our muse. Thus, Michelangelo gazed heavenwards into a crowded Sistine sky and told his dear Tommaso that though vain, malignant hordes attribute what their grosser wills obey, yet should this love, this faith, pure joys afford. How could he know? Upon his pallet there, creating heaven from a hell of cramped discomfort, chiselled trembling on the brink of freeing David's shoulder from chill rock. How could he know what trials the future held? How gross its will? My love, the vain, malignant hordes are with us still. The 16th century favoured cross-dressed men in women's roles, forging a bond between our culture and theatre that endures today. That era's greatest dramatist, in sonnets to his benefactor, Mr. W.H., proclaimed his love more ringingly than he portrayed the ruin of dynasties. In time, such friendship, passionately expressed, became the custom, and society, having no great desire to punish what was then a harmless commonplace, having no word for homosexuality, could draw platonic veils across our love and look away. Nowhere was this more evident than with the ladies of Llangollen, women living openly together in eccentric isolation, objects of suspicion yet also of fascinated awe, amusing in their tantrums, cherishing the picturesque. They scattered rosebuds round their cottage, banished Wordsworth when he slighted it in verse. Without them, history's diminished. We grew, but in obscurity. Emily Dickinson described her lover's breast as fit for pearls, her words unread, her voice unheard till she was dead. Amidst his dust-tanned boys, Walt Whitman dreamed a new city of friends, builded from tender glances in the hired hand scrum. So, Shakespeare dipped a quill into his troubled soul, while Eleanor and Sarah fired their servants and nailed poems to trees. On Emily's pure heart, her lover's weight a night. Who'll care, my love? Who'll guard such fragile gems as these? Only within enlightened cultures could we breathe. Natalie Barney's salon scandalised and entertained, where Gertrude Stein took tea and Mata Hari, naked, rode jewelled stallions. Outrageous Natalie, who, spurned by Renee Vivian, delivered herself in a satin coffin to the poet's door, while Paris smiled. Elsewhere, in Leipzig, 1869, one K.M. Benkert first referred to homosexuality. Industrial England's view that all might be explained by science prompted doctors to declare us merely ill, not friends or sinners after all. The molly houses rattled in the wind. The climate changed, as Oscar Wilde learned to his cost. Too fond of working lads, of feasting with the panthers. His beloved's father, a marquis, denounced him as a sodomite. Pressing for slander recklessly, Wilde was exposed, condemned to Reading jail, then exiled in disgrace. The era closed with Wilde's mauve 90s fading to grey, and yet contained the seeds of something proud, humane. From Germany before the century's end came the first protests against laws on sodomy. Emancipation had begun. Such times, born to Tchaikovsky's guns that could not drown his whispering heart. Such times that closed with our first faltering steps to liberty, and I marched as I loved, my dear, with thee, always with thee. Dignity marched abreast with shame. Disqualified from open love, we rendezvoused in squalor. All we were allowed. Our culture, embracing Colette, writing so perfectly with Missy's name upon her anklet, also came to know dark hallways, reeking lavatories, reminded in our tenderness of our equivalence with shit. The First World War, ironically, allowed new closeness. Young men lived and died together in the foreign mud. There, Wilfred Owen gave his love a sonnet and disc of identity, bidding his heartbeat kiss it night and day until the name grew blurred, fading away. Alas, war brought not comradeship alone, and in defeated Germany, the crippling war debt was a loam where fascist flowers thrived horribly. By 1933, we were already targets of the Reich, but still did not suspect how far we had to fall. In slaughterhouses labelled with pink triangles, our thousands died. The showers, they say, held bodies piled as if the strong and desperate had climbed on lovers' backs to flee the gas, betraying at the last our love, the thing we thought they couldn't take. Can you imagine? Can you? Darling, do not weep. 'Twas just a dream, a nightmare gathered on the century's brow, and if it comes again, I'll hold you tight till dawn, as best as I know how. As day broke over Europe, troops returned, some bringing newfound ways of life to settle on the Barbary coast, in Portsmouth or New York. New worlds seemed possible, and Ginsberg howled against a state that called us communists, not satisfied with branding us diseased. The Mattachine Society, America's first group for homosexual men, was formed in 1950, followed by the female-oriented Daughters of Bilitis. Meanwhile, England saw campaigns for homosexual rights, while Orton wrote of dark young men with new and dangerous moralities. In 1967, Britain legalised the sexual act between consenting adult males, while gradually across America, states came to modify their laws. Though still harassed, we were yet jubilant. The first rung in our climb achieved. We splashed in Hockney's pools and danced to Brian Epstein's band. On Friday, June the 27th, 1969, routine police raids on the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village sparked the riots from which gay liberation sprang. Did Judy Garland's death, or did 5,000 years of history propel us through the streets and with our anger fire the night? Remember running in between the blazing trash cans, holding hands, laughing above the sirens, unafraid and pure. We knew that freedom could be won, that nothing could prevent it. We were sure, my love. We were so sure. That was before the virus. AIDS changed everything. Though first affecting heterosexuals, who comprise 9/10 of those afflicted thus worldwide, the church and press spoke of gay plague. And we, so close to being recognised as fully human, were instead transformed to medieval bogeymen. A human tragedy thus licensed human bigotry. Policemen claimed to speak for God, describing persons having AIDS as swilling in a self-made cesspit, while Councillor Brownhill, a Conservative, recalled an earlier final solution offering to gas the queers, and Margaret Thatcher praised their forthrightness. She let a clause pass into law that her Chief Minister for Local Government described as being aimed at banishing all trace of homosexuality. The act itself, all gay relationships, even the abstract concept would be gone, a word torn from the dictionary. Shall we be scapegoats, as they used the Templars, Canaanites and Jews, or will AIDS force abandonment of prejudice, of furtive silence over sex, to save their very lives? As we approach the future, will utopia's spires hove into view, or death camp chimney stacks? My love, I wish I knew. While life endures, we'll love. And afterwards, if what they say is true, I'll be refused a heaven crammed with popes, policemen, fundamentalists, and burn instead, quite happily, with Sappho, Michelangelo, and you, my love. I'd burn throughout eternity with you. Thank you, that's great, thank you. I mean, I haven't got a lot prepared. I could just ramble for another, 10-15 minutes, and then throw it open to questions and answers, if anybody would like that. Does that sound good? Yeah, okay, right. My ramble then. Well, what am I doing at the moment? What are you doing at the moment, Alan? Well, that's interesting. Particularly in light of this, the work that I'm currently doing has taken me back into an awful lot of research into gay culture. It's a thing. It's based upon the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, who was a massively homophobic man. He was anti-Semitic. He was chronically racist. About everything was wrong with him that you can imagine. And I've still got a certain amount of sympathy for him, and I still think that he was a good writer. And the thing is, he was emblematic of all of the fears that were present in early 20th century America. Yes, he looks like a weirdo from our perspective, but looking at him from the perspective of his times, the things that he was hysterically frightened about were the things that most middle-class heterosexual men, white heterosexual men, were hysterically frightened about in his day and age. But the research that I'm having to do for this, having recently brutally slagged off every other writer in the industry for being lazy invertebrates, as I think I've called them, who are not prepared to do any research. That's not writing, that's typing, you know. But having said this, and I got on my high horse and then actually got that on the back of an even higher horse. Having slagged off everybody in the industry for not doing their research, that has rather made a rod for my own back, because if I make the smallest mistake, then quite rightly they're going to tear me to pieces. So I'm having to be very, very sure. And the central character that I've made up, because he's going to have to meet H.P. Lovecraft, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if he was secretly gay and secretly Jewish? And so I've had to investigate gay culture in America, specifically in New York, in 1919. And it's astonishing. The stuff that I've found out, I bet I know a lot of it that you don't know. Like the word gay, for example, where that comes from. From the late 19th century in New York, there was a massively visible gay presence. And the first openly visible gay men were male prostitutes. Now, female prostitutes had been known since Victorian times as gay women. So it's obvious you called the male equivalent gay men. So that was a little bit of a revelation. And then I found out about the gay terminology. The practice of referring to, say, men with female pronouns in conversation, which I'd always thought was a sort of a harmless, amusing affectation of no real significance. No, apparently it was a vital way of, I mean, there weren't any places specifically for gay people then. They'd be meeting in automats in places that were populated with complete heterosexual straight people. And so if they were talking about, oh, how's Vera? Oh, well, you know Vera, she was doing... No one would have any idea that they weren't talking about women. It was a necessary means of camouflage. I also found out about some of the expressions that, what the slang was like back then. You might say, how's Vera? And to which the other person might reply, I don't know who Vera is, incidentally, I've just made her up, you know, she's a completely fictitious person. She's probably not even a woman, you know. But so, well, you know her. She's wearing her hair up at the moment, but occasionally she drops a few hairpins. Now, what that means is that the stereotype for gay men and gay women back then was long-haired men and short-haired women. This was the stereotype. So, if you were a gay man who was passing as straight, you were wearing your hair up. But if you sometimes dropped a few hints as to your real sexuality, that was dropping a few hairpins. If you were with friends of your persuasion, then you could reveal your true identity by letting your hair down, which is the origin of that phrase. It was taken over by heterosexuals without any idea of what it originally meant. We've all used it. Oh, I'm going to really let my hair down tonight. Yeah, we probably don't mean it in the sense that sort of it was originally meant. Even the word heterosexuality, the best thing, the book that you should be looking at, the book that I've got all of this from, is called Gay New York by George Chauncey, and it's brilliant. And the best single sentence in it, he's quoting somebody else and he says, heterosexuality is an invention of the late 19th century, which is brilliant and true. Apparently before then, we didn't much care. I say in early New York, in the immigrant communities, in the working class communities, it was much more fluid, sexual identity. if you were a group of men going out for a night's carousing on the town, and if one of you happened to go off for an assignation with another man, as long as you were the active sexual partner, you could tell all your friends about it, and your heterosexual straight identity would not be compromised even slightly. It was much more fluid, at least in the immigrant cultures. The white middle-class Americans who were immigrants themselves, but just immigrants from a couple of hundred years earlier, and largely from England, it was them who were in a state of panic about all of this. You see, until we had the word homosexuality, which 1879, we didn't need a word for heterosexuality. But once we had defined homosexuality, then we had to sort of come up with a word for that, us normal people. If there's homosexuals, then how do we say we're not homosexuals? So we came up with the word heterosexual. And this strikes me as we've got pigeonholed into words. One of the most striking things that one of the gay men of the early 20th century who was interviewed said, and this is probably a contentious remark, but he said, we weren't gay when we were shaving, and that has been attacked as, well, he didn't want to show solidarity with other homosexuals, he was avoiding his... I think he's got a point. The thing is that heterosexuals do not have to go around every moment of their lives defining themselves as heterosexuals. They don't necessarily even think of themselves as heterosexuals because maybe their sexuality is not the single most important part of their being. It's, I appreciate that with the incredible abuse that has been levelled upon the gay community across the centuries, yes, it is necessary to actually establish a gay identity, but there is something to be said for that attitude that it isn't necessarily our sexuality that defines us. Yes, it's a huge part of what defines us, but it's probably not the only part. It probably would be better if we got back to how it originally was, with just a sense of different people who have different likes and dislikes. I mean, I tend to think of human sexuality as a spectrum disorder, and we're all on it somewhere, you know. So, okay, that's probably enough from me. I've got nothing, basically. I'm all used up. So, are there any questions? Yes.
Yeah, just out of interest, Mr. Moore, did the same go for bisexuality and transsexuality?
Well, the transgendered, I mean, I don't think there was actual transsexuality in the physical transformation sense back then. But the transgendered community, there was a huge community in the early 20th century, up to 1920, the gay balls in Harlem, which were fantastic, because they were bringing together black people, white people, people of different sexual persuasions. It was fantastic, and they were hugely attended. They were completely open. People tend to think that gay culture didn't exist before the Second World War. It was massive and vibrant and completely in people's faces in early 20th century New York. Some of these gay balls sound fantastic. There'd be drag competitions, and there was one of these, I've forgotten his name. He was a performer. He'd go on stage, and he was billed as a female impersonator, because I don't think they knew what else to call him. He'd go on stage dressed as a man, and he'd just stand there talking, albeit in quite a camp and affected manner. Oh, the word camp. The original expression was, "Oh, you are a camp," as in, you are a riot. That's where it comes from. But he'd be talking in a camp-affected manner until somebody in the audience shouted faggot or something like that at him, some bit of homophobic abuse. At that point, the real act would begin when he tore to pieces, brilliantly entertaining for the rest of the audience, where he absolutely destroyed whoever had made that comment. That was the act. He also did this, apparently a wonderful drag act at the Harlem drag balls. And the atmosphere in these places was apparently quite heady, because you were suddenly surrounded by people who were like you, who were sort of, you felt supported, and he just won the competition, and he was so full of it that he went out into the street outside the theatre, still wearing his costume, and went into the cafe next door to get a cup of coffee. And there were 4 guys in there who could not restrain themselves from commenting as he walked past in his full dragon makeup. And he beat 3 of them unconscious there and then in the cafe. The 4th one ran out into the street with this guy following, and had to shield behind a bunch of taxi drivers. And this guy was standing there with tears in his eyes. And one of his friends came up to him and said, "Why are you crying? You won. You beat them." And he said, "I know, but look at this dress." I mean, these are heroes whose names are forgotten, giants of gay culture. So, yeah, there was sort of, it was around, and it was public, you know. It was kind of, bisexuality, I think that was probably a later concept, because back then, the people who were weighing into the debate were doctors, who statistically, when places got raided, doctors were amongst the least homosexual profession, apparently. There were very seldom any doctors who got sort of picked up when a gay club was raided. Doctors, in fact, were weighing into the debate, talking about how homosexuality was an illness or a mental disorder, and they got great weight because they were doctors. They hadn't pointed out, yet we're also middle-class heterosexuals who are in a state of panic about the visibility of homosexual men. So what they said, it wasn't true. It wasn't actually based upon any real medical research. It was just their opinions. And so with the actual, people didn't really know what homosexuality and heterosexuality were. I think that bisexuality would have probably been a bit complicated for them back then, you know. Indeed, like I was saying earlier, in 1989, bisexuality was a bit complicated for the Organisation of Lesbian and Gay Action. So, yeah, I think that, but you'd be surprised how much of current thinking was in place back in the early 20th century. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you think we've got past the point in society where we're regress back to, say, the ideology of 1930s Germany? Or do you think it's still possible to go back?
Ooh, that's a big question, isn't it? I sincerely hope not. I would tend to think, my own feeling is, fascism, it didn't work, did it? It's an immensely simple-minded, it's not even a form of politics, for Christ's sake. It's some sort of weird religion that's based upon notions of the blood, or the Volk, or the race. Whereas, as far as I know, when we decoded the human genome, there are no indicators for race. You look at our genes, race is an illusion. It's not there. So, I mean, fascism could not even intellectually keep up with the state of human knowledge in the 1930s. So today, it's completely hopeless. Probably always has been. That's not to say that there aren't some completely hopeless people out there. And what's dangerous is when our leaders, through their own incompetence, have got us into an economic situation such as the one that we and the rest of the world are currently in at the moment, which is pretty bad. That's when things get tough for everybody, then all it needs is for somebody to say, yeah, the reason that things are tough is because of the Jewish banking conspiracy, this group of immigrants, this social group, the Sun doing sort of headlines about, oh well, if you want to get housing benefit, you have to be a gay disabled couple. Yeah, all of this stuff. Yet a lot of people are incredibly stupid. I'm not saying that in a pejorative sense. It's not their fault, probably. Although they probably could have tried a bit harder, couldn't they? But it's like we are living in an incredibly complex world. We are approaching a threshold of complexity which we do not know what is on the other side of. You know, I read New Scientist every week, and this is getting to be, I think complexity is our biggest problem because it underlies everything. We're not built for this level of complexity. I mean, I myself was born in a world where my grandmother didn't have electric light. We didn't have a flush toilet that was indoors. I'm not talking about Dickensian times here, I'm talking about 1950s. You know, it's the world has changed an awful lot since then, and the rate of change is speeding up. People, to bring us back to H.P. Lovecraft, he said that he thought it was the greatest mercy that humankind could not connect up all of its diverse bits of information. He said, but a day is coming when we will be able to connect up all this information. And the question is whether we will embrace that light or whether we will run from it into the sheltering shadows of a new dark age. And you look at, say, people like the fundamentalist Christians who are insisting, no, Darwin was completely wrong, scientists are completely wrong, there were no such thing as dinosaurs, and if they were, they existed 6,000 years ago when God created the world on a Monday. Bishop Ussher, who established that God created the world in around 4000 BC, he established also that it was on a Monday that he actually, which is probably about 9 o'clock on Monday morning. That's just my guess, you know. But that is a reaction. That's a reaction to the complexity of the world. We don't understand this. This is much too complicated for us. Let's dig our heels in and say everything in the Bible is literally true. The same thing is true with nationalism. As the internet starts to dissolve our national boundaries, I mean, what does it mean to say, I am English? A lot of my work is done with people who are in other countries. It's published in other countries. I get paid from other countries. I can talk to somebody on the other side of the world. Well, if I was actually connected up to the internet, which I'm not, but I've heard of it. You know, I know some people who apparently say that it's quite a good thing. You know, but it's possible now to talk to people on the other side of the world. My great-grandmother would never have travelled beyond 5 miles of her place of birth during her entire life, in all probability. The world was much smaller then, and now we're connected to all of it. And this sort of, the fact that national boundaries are kind of leaking away, that's what makes all of these nationalist groups. They get frightened, they want to dig their heels in. So that's the sort of stuff you've always got to watch out for. I personally don't think that fascism can work. I've never thought it could work. That's not to say that people wouldn't try it and make it really miserable for a lot of other people. And these kind of times are the times when you particularly got to watch out for it. And in my experience, if you see any fascism, just stamp on it until it's dead. That's the only way, you know, sort of don't try and reason with it, you know. But any others? Yes.
I'm fairly new to Northampton, and to going into the town centre, I see Greyfriars bus station and the Grosvenor Centre, and to be honest, I find it quite hard to love.
Oh,
So I was
yeah.
wondering your
Tell me about
opinion
it.
of where I could take myself to find somewhere that has what you think is a sort of atmosphere or heritage or a soul, if you
Well,
like.
I mean, there's lots of
Northampton.
places. There's lots of places. It's probably another hour-long lecture, but sort of, I mean, for me, there are places, yes, the Greyfriars and the Grosvenor Centre, these are hard to love. These are things that were imposed upon the town. And the bus station, incidentally, you're all probably aware that it has been voted the ugliest building in Great Britain. But what you probably don't know is, you know how the buses have to go all the way around it before they go back in through that? Do you know why that is? That's because when the plans were originally given to Northampton Council, somebody had got them upside down. I know. Now, where... I'll tell you what. If you are up for it, you go down to Doddridge Church. Doddridge Church, which is down... I mean, this is the area that I came from. It's the red light district. It's a slum. It's sort of, it's not a very nice looking place, but all of the history of the town is there. Go down to Peter's Church first. Down near the station, all that area. Peter's Church, I mean, that was built for the children of King Offa, who was the guy who tried to saw off Wales. There's the Offa's Dyke, which was an attempt to actually, no, it wasn't really, but it looks like it was attempting to saw off Wales. That's why we've got Kingsthorpe. There's only two places called Thorpe in the whole of Britain. There's Kingsthorpe in Northampton, and there's another Kingsthorpe in Norwich. And that's because King Offa, a thorpe is a country retreat. And that's because King Offa had got his country retreats in Norwich and in Northampton. So he had to have a market town to supply the country retreat. He built Peter's Church when it was a Saxon church, before it was remade by the Normans when they turned up. But there's still Saxon grotesques, these faces leering from the stonework. A lovely place. And just up the road from there, there's Doddridge Church, which is a much more humble building and much later. But that's where Philip Doddridge, and he was a lad, he was great. He was sort of, I mean, I'm a pagan, and I'm probably worse than that actually. I mean, I'm a practicing warlock. But I've got a lot of respect for people like Philip Doddridge. He reorganised the entire Anglican Church from that little mound of dirt in the middle of the boroughs. He basically got them to include all of the non-conformist religions, like the Baptists and the Quakers, who back in the day, the Quakers, they weren't like that nice bloke on the porridge packets at all. they were really radical. They'd take their clothes off to make a political point. They believed in free love. They believed in the violent overthrow of the crown. We had some pretty strange dissident types, and they all tended to mass around Northampton. That's why we were big favourites with Cromwell. We were huge supporters of Oliver Cromwell until we found out that he was basically like the 17th century's answer to Joseph Stalin. How were we to know? I mean, we made all the boots for him here, and I don't think he paid us. We also made all the boots for the Confederate South in the American Civil War. So we obviously knew how to pick a winner. But all of that area, it's thick with history. The Castle Station, that's where Thomas à Becket was brought and tried. He had to escape from the castle in the middle of the night and flee to France for 6 years before he came back and got murdered anyway. There's nearly every place down there there's a little stretch of grass that's got one house standing at the end of it, a little way along Andrews Road, which is just down from the station, and on that patch of grass, that's where I was born. And there were houses there when I was. We were primitive, but we weren't quite that primitive, But yeah, Seps Church, the round church on Sheep Street, which is again in the boroughs. There's musket ball holes in the front of that church. You can put your fingers into them. That was when there was a load of royalists held in it under siege during the Civil War. This town bleeds history, and yeah, it's not in the Grosvenor Centre, it's not in the bus station, it's you have to look for it, but there's plenty of it there, and some of it looks a bit ugly, but that doesn't mean that it isn't important and interesting and perhaps has a wonderful soul, Any other questions? Yes?
How do you feel about the fact that it sort of seems fashionable to have a token gay character in something nowadays when you had to fight for it in the past? Like, does it feel like an achievement or?
Yeah, well, it's all of these things you have to sort of say, well, yeah, that must be better. That must be better. It must be better than it was. I guess there is an improvement. However, in my heart, you sometimes think, well, it's like with comics. When people say, I bet you're really pleased now that comics are really acceptable and sort of they're winning literary prizes. And I have to say, I don't read them anymore, I'm not interested in them. Once they're acceptable, they're no longer of any interest to me at all. I don't like acceptable things, they're a bit dull. And so I can't help but think that maybe to some degree gay culture, by being accepted, by being assimilated, has perhaps lost some of its more confrontational edges, that also the token gay characters that you see in things, generally they're a stereotype, aren't they? Because the writer is having to signal, this is a gay man, or this is a gay woman. So they'll have to put in bits of dialogue which will stereotype the character. It's probably for the mass of television viewers, it is helping to normalise the idea of gay people. That is probably a good thing, but it's just not much fun to watch. I don't know on that one. It's I think that it's probably a good thing, but but tokenism, it'll probably be another decade or so before you can get gay characters who just happen to be gay entering into dramas in the same way that black characters can do these days, where it's not a big oh look, this character's black, aren't we being liberal? You know, it's like, I think it'll probably take a while to normalise. It's probably a step in the right direction, but it just seems like a bit of a tedious step, you know. Any other questions? Well, I've exhausted your interest. That's great. Well, so is that roughly the end?
Yeah, that's fine.
Hey, well, look, you've been great. I mean, sort of, thanks ever so much for turning out, you know, and hopefully I can get up here and do this again sometime.